So welcome, everybody. We want to ask for today, you actually will be signed in since you're on Zoom. I'm sure we'll have more people joining us, but we do ask that you please help us out with being engaged in the session. And then also towards the end of the session, I'm going to put the link for feedback in the chat box. So if you will help us out with that. Next slide.
It's not responding.
You might have
I
to.
might have to push the little arrow. There we go.
There we go. Okay. So this is the South Texas Regional Family Medicine Grand Rounds, and we are partnered with the South Central AHEG. And you can see that our department's mission statement is listed there. Next slide. For those who are registering for CME credit for this presentation, you will want to make sure that you make note of this code here, and you'll need to send that code with the word attend, the code, and then you'll send that to the toll-free number listed there on the screen. But if you have any issues, please make sure that you reach out to me. But again, make sure that you do that before midnight tonight. On the next slide, I will just let you know, if you haven't done this process yet, if you are new to the CME process, you'll first need to text your email address to the number listed there. And then from there, you should be registered and able to use the code. But if you have any questions or any concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Next slide. Those who are claiming credit, please make sure that you do check your CME transcript from time to time to make sure that you are getting the credits that you've claimed. And if there are any issues, the CME office should be able to help you. And you're also, again, more than welcome to reach out to me as well. Next slide. For those who are members of the AAFP, you can also use that transcript from the CME office and submit that to the AAFP to claim credits through their system. Again, their information is listed there, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me as well. Next slide. So we do want to also mention that it is our goal to reach these nationally established physician core competencies during our grand round session. So those are listed there for you. Next slide. And we will just mention that Dr. Ferrer has no financial relationships with ineligible companies to disclose. And next slide. I know that everybody knows Dr. Ferrer, so I don't know how much of an introduction I can give for him. He is going to be talking to us, though, specifically today regarding writing for publication and helpful strategies. So I'll let him go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Nicole, and good afternoon, everybody. We're going to spend a few minutes this afternoon talking about something that being here on the faculty at a health science center, we're expected to do, many of us. We like to do, that's why we're here, as opposed to maybe other settings that we might be working on. And physician writing is actually, has a long and stellar tradition. Physicians see the good side and the bad side of society, the good side and the bad side of how society deals with health and healthcare. And so we have a privileged point of view in terms of knowing what's happening in our communities, in our country, in our clinics. And it's good to share that, because what we do obviously is important to the well-being of our fellow citizens and our fellow inhabitants around the world, really, because a lot of these challenges are shared broadly these days across many different settings. So that's our mission for the grand rounds. I want to acknowledge that parts of this presentation are crowdsourced. It's contributed to by the list of names you see there, which was the editorial group at the Annals of Family Medicine, where I've been an associate editor since 2009. We've traveled around the country to NAPCRAG and STFN and other venues using some of the slides that I'm going to show today. And so I just want to give credit to the people who contributed to putting together the insights that I'll cover. So here are the objectives for the session. We'll cover some of the mechanics of writing and publishing journal articles. We'll talk about how to select a target journal for a specific paper. We'll review a cookbook for a research paper. It's not all cookbooky, but there are some best practices that you can use that help streamline your writing and your interactions with the journal that we'll talk about. We'll give you a little bit of an understanding of how journals review what you send them. This way you can anticipate questions or issues that might come up and get a sense for what is routine habit among what journal editors do and what might be something special that they're asking you to do in regards to a specific contribution. We'll talk a little bit about effective writing habits. All of us, I think, are busy people, and in most cases, writing is the thing with the least momentum behind it, because there are always notes to close, there are always meetings to go to, there are grand rounds to prepare for, and writing, gets prioritized last among all those things unless we really make a conscious effort to make it otherwise. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So why write? The top reason that we write in healthcare is to critique the status quo. Obviously, we work in a profession that's built on constant advancements, improving over what we did yesterday and last year and 100 years ago. We learn things as we go, interesting observations, transformative experiences, things that deeply touch us as human beings in our own emotional state, in our own thinking. And if something touches you, it's likely that it's going to touch someone else as well. So it's an opportunity to share your experience and hopefully maybe help someone navigate the same issue more gracefully or with less angst in the future based on what you've learned. Many of us are scientists, even if we don't think of ourselves that way, but we are, we practice the science of what we do in our caring activities. And sometimes we take a larger viewpoint and think more purely as scientists in terms of doing experiments or observational studies to help advance the state of knowledge on a specific topic. And sometimes you just write for yourself. You face a very difficult situation and grapple deeply with it. And then the end result of that might be making notes to yourself or writing an essay, or then thinking that, hey, enough people are worried about this that this could be shared more broadly, and then you think about publishing it. A beautiful example of personal writing is the article that Dr. Nato sent, penned by our Dr. Sandra Burge, about her family situation, and I spent a few minutes reading that this morning and was deeply touched by it. And I think if you click on that link, you'll find the same thing is true. So with those introductory remarks, we'll kind of walk through the steps of writing a paper and submitting it and getting feedback. So the first important thing is to decide what your paper is about, which sounds trivial, but in many of the things we do, they have a lot of angles to it. So if you're writing about the integration between, let's say, primary care doctors and behavioral health practitioners, there are a lot of ways to do that. You could talk about what financial models are available to make that possible in a given organizational setting. You can talk about, well, how effective handoffs work at a clinic visit to make sure that the patient is likely to follow up with the behavioral science provider that they've just been introduced to. You can talk about improved outcomes as a result of those collaborations, and a whole string of other facets of that issue that could be written about. Think about who your audience is. Are you writing for a primary care journal? Are you writing for a more general medical journal where internists and other people who take care of adult patients might be reading? Are you writing for a health policy journal? Are you writing for a humanities journal where, again, it's more the your inner reaction to something that's the focus of the paper rather than any policy or care aspects. A good tip and when you're deciding what your paper is about, is to write the abstract first. The abstract, depending on the journal, will give you 150 words or 300 words or 500 words to summarize your paper. And writing the abstract first makes you really crystallize the boundaries of what you're going to talk about, what seems in scope and what maybe seems in scope when you start, but then when you read it as a whole, you think, oh, that's kind of dressing here. We don't need to go into that so deeply, because that's not the core of what I want to talk about. So the abstract forces you to think of what is the core you're going to talk about in not very many words. So it's a good exercise to go through. Then again, maybe counterintuitively, the next thing that you want to do, if it's data paper, is make the tables and figures. And the reason to do that is because the tables and the figures are the meat. That's where you show people your findings, what you can prove with numbers or pictures or graphs. And that's what a lot of readers will look at ultimately first, to say, okay, what's the meat? And then if it's compelling enough, if they see big reductions in blood pressure, let's say, or large adherence to follow-up visits in a table, they'll say, okay, that seemed to really work. Let me read the rest of the paper and see how they accomplish that. So the tables and figures have to stand on their own and be as compelling as possible. Only after you've done those first forays into how do I best capture people, then you can start outlining what language am I going to put in the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion to support that. And then at the end, even though usually if you're writing a paper, you know the literature at least reasonably well in the subject area, you want to do a focus review before you start writing, just to make sure you're not missing something that came out last week or last month. And there's going to be part of the buzz about the topic, which if you don't talk about it, you'll see maybe a step or two behind that's current. So again, not the whole history of literature in an area, but maybe look at what's come out in the past year that you may not be familiar with, and make sure you catch up on those. Involve collaborators. Writing is in some ways intensely lonely. Typically we write alone, but it's more fun once people have written alone to involve collaborators and work as a team. Often you'll involve content experts who know a lot about a topic, and then you'll have methodologists who might be your statisticians or someone who's an expert in, again, behavioral science, behavioral health care, delivery in primary care, and you'll be contributing different parts to the paper. And then later on, once you're further enough down the road, so you have some products, use some writers and readers. These are people who were not part of the research team or the project team, or the quality improvement team. And so for whom the words you use, the ideas that you're presenting might be unfamiliar, and they're going to be the cues to where you're not explaining things well enough for the non-specialist or for the newbie, or for an experienced person who maybe isn't accustomed to new terminology and might be mystified by jargon that you use. So those folks will help you stay out of trouble with being opaque in your writing. And then again, something that all of us who write struggle with is finding time to do it, because it's never at the most urgent thing that you're going to do in a day is work on your paper. So find a methodology that works for you, setting deadlines, setting aside daily, weekly writing times that are as sacred as possible in your schedule. The people have done a lot of strategies for this. I know physician writers who set their alarm clock for 4:30 every morning, and do as much as they can before it's time to take a shower and go to work. That doesn't work for everybody, obviously. If you have a newborn at home, you're already doing something at 4:30 in the morning that conflicts with writing papers. So it might be maybe a Saturday that you set aside if you have time. Anyway, we all negotiate with ourselves what works for us, but it's important to negotiate something that you have some hope of sticking to, because I said otherwise writing is always tends to be the last priority on your daily list. Okay, so everywhere along the path, try to seek some critical feedback from people that you know, might be your co-authors, might be people in your clinic or friends and family who will review you and read your writing, and draw some general concepts from it. Obviously, you don't have to make a change in response to every single suggestion that someone makes, but you can say, oh, people don't seem to be understanding the methods very well, or how we set up the focus groups, or people are confused by that graph. And if you hear something over and over, then it's probably true. And when you send it out, not only to the 3 friends that are reading your paper, but to the thousands of readers of the Journal of Family Practice, they'll probably have the same issues. So it's good to get a head start on those problematic issues in your paper and pay attention. There are a lot of styles of people writing, and when they write and how they write. Some people like to write in hard copy still. The act of writing cursive slows them down a bit and makes them think, be more mindful about their saying. Other people would rather die than go back to writing cursive, and having to start over every time you write a paragraph instead of just editing on a word processor. So find something that works for you. In a writing place in quotes might be a frame of mind, it might be a time of day, it might be at a special desk in your house that's away from distractions. So you can get your creative juices flowing just by sitting in that spot and triggering your writing neurons. Revision is really important to writing. A saying I like is there's no such thing as good writing. There's only good revising, good revision. Because it's hard to get things down right the first time. And even after they sound right to you, after the 3rd time maybe you've gone over it, they may not sound right to an outside third-party reader. At a certain point, you've got to stop. You've got to say, okay, that's enough writing. I could work on this my whole career and publish half a paper, and that's not my goal. So look to see that you've made things as concise as possible, as logical as possible, and as clear as possible, and get third-party opinions on whether you've met those 3 goals. And follow the rules that I just went over, but usually when it's necessary to break the rules, go ahead and do so. So when do you write? Lucy Candid is one of our fabulous family medicine scholars and writers. Many of you may have seen essays that she's written about especially issues in the humanities that have to do with family medicine, and I recommend her if you haven't. She wrote a nice paper really almost 20 years ago about making time to write, and she talked about 3 strategies for writing time. Clear the decks, that means get rid of all your other responsibilities and then sit down and write. So you can write without guilt. Wedge it in means keep doing all your other responsibilities, but be opportunistic. If clinic ends 15 minutes early on a particular day, give yourself those 15 minutes to go back to your paper and maybe write a paragraph, maybe stuff in some references, wedge it in. Or the most effective, but probably the most difficult one to do is schedule it. And it's not always scheduling it that's hard to do, it's living up to your scheduling. So say, okay, today after clinic, I'll spend 20 minutes editing that essay, or Sunday afternoon after I've spent some time, taking the kids to the park, I'm going to spend an hour pushing ahead the methods section in the paper I'm writing. There are a lot of books, helpful books on writing to build your capacity. I've listed a couple oldies but goodies there in the capacity building section. On the mechanics of writing nonfiction, which is what most of us do, there's a book I found just incredibly useful. Again, it's not new, but it talks about best practices in terms of sentence structure, writing nonfiction that's not stuffy, that moves along, that keeps people interested, that isn't boring. The book is available on Amazon for $4.73. And so if you're looking for some inspiration, when you're just stuck and wondering, what is the approach to writing the next page of this nonfiction work, this will help you think about your word choices and your sentence structures and sequencing paragraphs and all those writerly kinds of tasks. Okay, so those are some background issues about writing that are common to poets and physician investigators and I should say family medicine investigators alike. Where do you submit your paper? That is often the first choice because journals have all kinds of different requirements and you don't want to format 15 pages of a paper for the New England Journal and then end up sending it to JAMA because they'll be different and you'll have to do some rework. So think about who reads the journals that you want to submit your paper to. What is the paper about? What is the message? Is it a message for practitioners? Is it a message for politicians? Is it a message for funders? Is it a message for lay people? What do they read? They don't necessarily read journals, all of them. Obviously, lay people usually don't. Maybe you want to write a newspaper article or an op-ed. If you're looking at journals that you yourself read and respect is a good place to start. If you're reading that journal and like the journal, the papers that you find in there, probably people like you will do the same, and it's a good place to submit your paper. If you're more impact oriented, people go by things like impact factors, which is how often and how widely a publication will get cited. Now, citations are useful in a narrow world, which is scholars. Your mother and your brothers and sisters don't cite papers unless they do what you do. But if for promotion, for example, promotion committees will look at things like index, how often your publications get cited in different indices. There's something called the impact factor, which look at in the 2 years after publication, how many citations your publication earned. And that number can be very small, sometimes less than one, or it can be very many in the hundreds, depending on how many people were interested in your findings and how many scholars cited it. These days, we use also, besides the traditional metrics of people putting you in their reference section, there are things called alt metrics. How many tweets came out about your paper? How many blogs mentioned your paper? Journals, websites, and so on who posted your paper. And those obviously have more immediacy and, depending on your audience, may be more meaning to you than journal citations. One thing to be very knowledgeable about and careful about are predatory journals. There's an enormous group of scholars in the world, and many of them get promoted and therefore advanced in their seniority and their earnings by promotion committees looking at the impact of their scholarship. A very easy way to judge scholarship, even though it may not always be deeply meaningful, is things like impact factors. Journals know that, and they know that there's a market essentially for people to get their papers published. Now, most of the journals that we think about every day, New England Journal, JAMA, Annals of Internal Medicine, Annals of Family Medicine, etc., don't charge authors to publish. They have scientific societies or professional groups that fund their journals, and so it doesn't cost you a dime to publish there. But there are many, many journals that want to take $500, $1,000, $2,000 in publication fees, and those are called predatory journals. The problem with those predatory journals is many of them are not read, they're not cited, they're not respected. And so they do fill out your CV, but are not very satisfying in terms of your scholarly self-image and your impact on the field. There are so many of them now that there's a list of them, which is up on the slide. You can check to see if your journal falls in that category. Again, it's market driven though, and it can be hard to stay ahead of the new ones that pop up every day. So talk to mentors, look and see what they publish, and make sure you're making an educated choice in which journal to submit to. Next, we'll go briefly through kind of a cookbook for a journal article. And there we go. This is just to make sure that as you're preparing a paper, you're hitting all the right parts. Title page, which is going to list you, your authors, your institution. Sometimes things like the word counts and who funded the work, if anyone did. And then these are all pretty typical. I'm not going to spend time just naming them. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of each one. So the title page will list, again, what the title of the paper is, the authors, the affiliations, which author is going to be in charge with corresponding with the journal, acceptance, rejection, and then if it's accepted, negotiating all the tables and figures and paginations, discussants, who the journal will invite to comment on your paper, and so on. It'll show the word count, which journals often strictly enforce because they want to publish as many papers as possible. Who funded the work? And then also very important is conflicts of interest. So if a commercial entity funded the work, if it was funded by a traditional granting agency, if it was unfunded, they want to know that because they want to know early on if there's any conflicts of interest that they should be aware of. For example, if you're seeking a patent on something, the journal will want to know that. If you benefit from a commercial service that you're plugging, they want to know that too. They get very upset when they find that out after the fact. So please be honest in your conflicts of interest statements. The title kind of seems like a throwaway, but it's not. It should be very carefully crafted. Think of it as your movie title, your billboard, to attract the right people, the right audience to read your paper. Only about 1 out of 500 people who look at the title read the paper, so make it as compelling as possible. These days, when so many searches are based on Google Scholar and search engines, make sure that you put in the right trigger words to make search engines and readers make your paper findable among the people who need to see it. So it's about primary care, and we want to get internists and pediatricians as well as family doctors. Put primary care in the title. If it's about behavioral health, put behavioral health in the title. So those search engines will make the right hits. Some journals have very specific guidance on titles. Some don't let you use declarative sentence like metformin saves lives. You might say, they might let you talk about that in scientific terms, but you can't have something that's just too declarative and says, these are the results. The journal's outlook is more, well, people will read your whole paper and then decide if what you're saying is true. We're not going to just let you assert that it's true very boldly in the title. That usually that's not an issue, but just so you know that can be a consideration at some journals. The abstract is critical. Again, it's not a throwaway that you piece together after the whole paper is finished. Yes, you do it at the end, but you should be thinking about the abstract the whole way through. If you find some compelling language, make notes. And it should stand alone as a very brief summary of the main points, again, because if there's a lot of winnowing from reading the title to reading the abstract, there's a lot of winnowing from people who read the abstract to read the whole paper. So the abstract has to be as compelling as possible. So again, the subject heading keywords are critical to stuff as many relevant ones into the abstract as possible. So the right search engines and the right readers do find your paper. Abstracts come in 2 flavors. There are short abstracts used by some journals with the traditional 4 areas of purpose, methods, results, conclusions. And then journals like Annals of Family Medicine, for example, want more control over what's in the abstract and to make sure you're touching on all the critical things that readers want to look at. So the background, the objective, the design, the setting, the participants, interventions, the outcomes, the results, and the conclusion. Now, it's challenging to do all of those in very few words. So you really got to put your conciseness hat on when you put those together. A good way to think about an abstract is a kind of a structured outline. So why we did the study: 1 sentence on the general problem, It might be that antidepressants are underused in primary care. And one sentence on the research question or the purpose. Actually, I inverted those. So the general problem might be major depression is very common in primary care. That's the general problem. And the one sentence is that antidepressants can be underused depending on the setting. And then the traditional methods, design, participants, what you did, what the outcomes were, how you analyzed it. When you budget the words in your abstract in general, give about half to the results. Again, because that's the exciting part. The rest is kind of is methods, and the methods can be important, but people aren't reading your paper for the methods, they're reading for what they should change in their daily practice, right? So you're going to give half the word allotment to that. And then one sentence on the main take-home lesson, and one sentence on the implication. Who, so what, and who should care about the findings. The introduction. The idea is to set up this study. The error people make a lot in the introduction is to review the world literature on something going back to the Middle Ages. And then so-and-so in 1960 this happened, and in 1970 that happened. You don't want to do that. You want to set up this particular study. Yes, you want some historical context on that, but the stuff that's the most relevant, that talks about the particular innovation that you're making and how that emerges out of a context, but in a focused way. And then generally you want to end up with a paragraph that begins something like, you don't have to be verbatim on what you say, but therefore, given what I just said in the setup, this study was undertaken to blah, blah, blah. So the reader understands that where you're coming from and exactly what problem you're taking on and why it's important to them. They should understand why it's important to them to read your paper, because it's a problem that they're struggling with as well. Methods, again, pretty typical. Method section, we'll talk about the design. Was it an observational study? Was it an RCT? Where did your participants come from? Where did you find them? At what sites? What you did? Didn't have to be experimental procedures. It might be, if it's epidemiology, it just might be data collection. What measures you used and why? And then the analyses. If it's a qualitative paper, you're taking on a different set of questions, and a different set of things becomes important. The qualitative paper, reflexivity is important, and that means acknowledging and dealing with the fact that when we're dealing with observations we make in the world, it's not the view from nowhere, as people say, it's the view from somewhere. So you've got to acknowledge who you are, why you see the world in the way you did, and why you're in a position to interpret what your informants told you in a certain way, and being upfront about that so people can understand that you did it from a practitioner point of view, or a patient point of view, or a policymaker point of view, and they can interpret the findings more easily. Again, even if it's a qualitative study, people want to know where you found your participants. If there were any experimental procedures that they're responding to, what they were, the kinds of analyses that you did, and often qualitative findings come out in a sequential way. So you start with some very top level themes and then dig deeper, and then look on what's underneath the top level themes, and then you get to some deeper themes, and then some lessons, for example. And so it has its own kind of language and structure in a qualitative paper. The results, okay, here's the fun part where you get to show what you did and what you found and what's new. Often there'll be tables and figures. The tables and figures should stand by themselves, but then you should refer to them in the prose in the results section. So don't go overboard repeating numbers from the results in the prose, because that gets very boring. So just highlight the main findings. And then if there are some findings that weren't large enough for a table, you can put those in the results section as well. Discussion often is the hardest to write because you have a lot of latitude for what you might say. The main thing you're going to do is emphasize and synthesize the main findings. You're going to say why they're important in the context of what we already know. And again, you don't have to go back 300 years, but in the context of what practitioners are doing today, what scientists are learning today about this area, and why this either ratifies what we think or turns it on its head. Draw new conclusions, be honest about the strengths and weaknesses of what you did, and talk about, for scholars, talk about the implications for future studies. For practitioners, talk about the implications for clinics and practice, or whether you're, if it's a teaching paper for how we train residents or what we do with students or social workers and so on. Papers might need an acknowledgement section. Those are people who don't meet criteria for authorship in terms of being involved start to finish, but maybe help with a particular, setting up a particular statistical analysis, or give you access to a database or something like that. And then acknowledge the funding sources and major work possible. Every journal is going to have different formatting guidelines, so please pay attention to those. It can be a little bit embarrassing when you use the formatting guidelines for a journal that people recognize and say, oh, okay, I guess we weren't their first choice. Or even worse yet, they don't change the cover letter and it still says, I'm pleased to submit this paper to the New England Journal of Medicine, and it's at the Journal of Family Practice. Please use, if you have one and know how to use one, use a bibliographic database to do reference management. Renumbering 128 references, and so you can make 3 or 5 changes in the long list is needless rework and should be avoided if possible. Okay, the tables, make sure you're putting in descriptive headlines and titles so people can understand exactly what numbers you're showing them. Usually people like to see the N in the subheading so they know if your result is based on 5 people or 5,000. And then if there are details about the papers, you can put footnote right there in the, footnotes about the table. Put the footnotes right there in the table next to it and define any abbreviations, since opaque abbreviations are another source of reader frustration. Most epidemiological studies will have a table 1.
Take all my stuff to the guest services.
Hello? Okay, table 1 is going to be who's in the study. Table 2 is going to be this is what their findings were, and then table 3 will be multivariable analysis. So controlling for age or controlling for health insurance status. We found these things. The results are generally sequenced from less complex to more complex analyses. So, here's an example. Participants took 56% of prescribed medication doses. Now, breaking it down, older patients were more likely than younger patients to take their medications. But in a multivariate, when we controlled for prescription coverage, medication adherence was equally likely among younger and older patients. So what's on the surface, what's a little bit deeper, and maybe what's at the root of the problem. Figures, think about what should be best presented graphically. You can show a theoretical model. You can show a flow diagram of the patients coming or participants coming in and out of the study. If you did a qualitative study, you might have a logic model for why people take medicine or don't, or why they exercise or they don't. So you may create a figure to go with that. And then, graphs and photos. You're writing a paper that's about dermatology, often it'll be photo heavy. Anything that you think is important or informative can go in an appendix, and most people won't look at it, but if someone wants to replicate what you did and take a deep dive, the appendix is very useful. Appendices are also good for longer chunks of text that you don't want to put in the paper, but that again, for someone who wants to take a deep dive into a focus group, can see a transcript, for example. A few tips for publication. Titles should be short, catchy, and accurate. You don't want to mislead people by selling too much sizzle or more than sizzle than you have, but you don't want to undersell it either. Again, I already talked about the importance of the abstract. Write short if you can. Match the length of the paper to the novelty or impact on the field. Consider using an appendix for subsets of readers who might be specialists or want to replicate what you do. And don't repeat in words what is easy to figure out from the tables and figures. And it takes a lot of pruning and work to write a short paper. I would have written a shorter letter, but I did not have the time. It's kind of like that with papers too. you got to go over, you got to kind of sift through a paper about 10 times to take out all the redundancies and maybe things that are obvious that you don't need to say that you still ended up saying. Okay, the special category is an essay. The essays are easier to write in some ways. They can come out of your own head. They should be fresh ideas or a new twist on a familiar topic. Don't take it as a latitude to give your opinion on everything ever, always. Stay focused on a specific question or a well-defined story. Here, you don't have to write in the scientific sort of way, kind of way. It can be very personal, let your narrative voice come through. And again, have people read them before you submit them for clarity and flow of ideas to make sure people interpret it the same way that you do. Talked about qualitative research tips already. Sometimes you do a multi-method study where you start with a qualitative study and then publish an epidemiological study that comes after it. And you have different strategies to do that if you want. You can publish them separately in different journals. You can publish one in a qualitative journal, one in a quantitative journal, if that makes sense to do that, and link to the other articles. You can publish them together if a journal wants to give you space for 2 papers. You can publish one longer article that describes both and talks about how they reinforce each other or maybe contradict each other. Or you can publish them uniquely and then publish a third paper that says, okay, now that we've looked at it from a qualitative and a quantitative point of view, this is what we think the lessons are. So these are different publication strategies that you can look at as do something that we often do in family medicine, which is start with observations and then see how common those kinds of issues actually are in a quantitative paper. Quick overview of what happens when your paper goes to a journal. These days, they're almost all online. Someone in the front office, the editorial office, will look at it for completeness. They'll tell you if you forgot to submit anything, maybe you forgot to tell them who funded the study, or you forgot to talk about, or you promised table 2 and there isn't one. And they say, oh, hey, you forgot to attach table 2, please do that. Then someone in the editorial office will look at the paper, at the Annals of Family Medicine. It tends to be the editor-in-chief and an associate editor. Depending on the journal, again, they'll get from dozens to thousands of submissions a year. So there is a triage function. They can't review every paper that comes in. They'll look at it for novelty. They'll look at it for importance to the field. Is this something really new? Is this is this essay very compelling? Will it be useful for policymakers, practitioners, patients, stakeholders? And then make a decision on either send it out for review, which is what you want as an author. You want it to go out for review and get feedback on it. Or they'll do what's called an editorial rejection. They'll say, we just published a special issue on this topic in the last issue, and we had 14 papers on the same topic. So we think we've covered it pretty well this year in the journal, and we're going to send it out. Or the paper doesn't follow any of our guidelines for formatting, so we're not going to say don't ever send it back, but we'll say please format it according to our requirements and then send it back to us. So what the good news means that your paper has been sent out for peer review, and then it disappears for a while. Depending on the length of the paper and how busy the peer reviewers are, that might take 2 weeks. It might take 2 months. In some journals, even longer than that. But you can be happy during that time and know that your paper is being seriously considered for publication, and wait for the email that talks about the decision. So the associate editors are the workhorses who make those intermediate decisions, and then the reviewers will come back with their reviews, say what's good and bad, give a preliminary judgment on accept with revisions, reconsider with revisions. That's what almost all papers get. Hardly any papers are ever perfect enough to just be taken off the rack, so to speak, or reject with we don't want to see this again. So revise and resubmit it is excellent news. And it triggers then a couple weeks of hard work responding to many, sometimes 50 suggestions from 3 peer reviewers and an associate editor. So again, be happy for a couple days, but then get to it. So let me skip this for a minute. Again, revision is required for almost all accepted papers. The editor's letter will come back and say, yes, we're very interested in this paper. Sometimes they'll put reviews in context for you to say, you know, reviewer 2 really hyped about the length of time that it took to do these interviews, but that's okay with us. The fact that it took a year doesn't invalidate the findings. So you don't have to respond to that necessarily, or you can respond very briefly. And then they'll give you very specific instructions for the paper is too long, try to cut 400 words from the discussion, or you like table 1, table 2 seems to overlap too much, so think about combining them, and so on and so forth. You don't have to follow everything they say. You probably should give it serious consideration. But if you wanna rebut something, that's fine. You can say, you know, we really think two tables makes more sense here for the following reasons. Now, rejection, again, a lot of journals have way more papers than they can publish, so it's not necessarily a harsh judgment on your paper. Sometimes it has to do with the quality of the study being described. Sometimes it's a very important topic. It just wasn't written up in a compelling way for a non-specialist, let's say. It may not be a great fit for the journal. And so before submitting a paper, it's good to peruse. If it's not a journal you regularly read, to peruse some last editions of the journal to make sure you know you're in the wheelhouse of what they like to talk about. Or it's just that there are more good manuscripts than space. A lot of journals get, again, you know, many hundreds of submissions, sometimes thousands, for a journal that can publish 10 papers per issue per month. Don't be discouraged about resubmitting. Don't let the paper wallow on your desk for 8 months before you send it back. Do it soon, both for reasons of that topic being fresh in your mind and convincing the editors that you're serious about, not the editors, but the next journal, that you're not going to let this slide into nowhere land. The rebuttal letter is very important. The strategy is to number all the concerns that come back from the editors and the reviewers, and then just take each one. Don't be angry. You can be firm and straightforward. If you think they got something wrong, say so politely and why, and justify it. And then just work to improve the manuscript. If they said it was too long, look for places where you can shorten things up. If they wanted something that needed more description, you can add to it without going overboard. Before you send it again in a second time, have someone else read it again, just like you did the first time. Have someone else look at the revision, and you can ask them and say, "Hey, you think I responded? If you were reading the rebuttal letter and the responses, does that seem angry? Does it seem respectful? Do you think we did what they asked us to do?" If at the end they still reject it and you feel like they made a mistake, you can challenge an editor's decision. You can write to the editor-in-chief and say, "We think you guys making a mistake here for the following reasons." It's rare to get a reversal, but not unheard of. But again, respectfulness and being very cogent and convincing is important. Now, the last step is your manuscript's been accepted. Hooray. Celebrate. These days, journals want not only people to subscribe to their journal, they want buzz. And they want wide buzz in the ecosystem of buzz, which means not only your paper comes out, but it gets tweeted about. It gets on listservs. It gets into press releases in your institutions. You know, what's happening at UT Health San Antonio today, maybe the local newspaper, if it's something that's relevant to your region. Respond to those quickly, because even though it might have taken 3 months to get your review back, once the paper is accepted, the production line at the journal kicks into high gear, and they've got to make everything look perfect for the next month's issue or the next week's issue if it's a weekly. And so it gets very stressful for them at that point. And you want to help them get your paper into print. So please respond in a timely way to the things they ask you for after the fact. And other than some references that I put here just for you to look at, that's it. And we have just a couple of minutes for questions, perhaps, or comments.
I don't see any in the chat box, but if anybody would like to unmute to either ask a question or comment, please feel free to do so.
Dr. Ferrer, this is Rose Ramos. I had an addition when I was a graduate student. My mentor had me review manuscripts alongside her. She would have me review them first, and then she would chime in on what was an appropriate item to point out, or an appropriate critique during the review. And I dreaded the exercise because it was hard. I mean, she was a journal editor for many years, and she had extraordinary expertise, and so I was on a learning curve. But years later, I realized I realized how to present an argument in a manuscript as opposed to an oral presentation or a poster. And so my advice is that for those that are considering, or they get invitations to review for a journal, or sometimes they submitted a manuscript that wasn't accepted, and then the journal has the audacity, to reach out to them and ask them if they would like to review a manuscript that they feel is in their field of expertise, accept it, because there's no way to teach how to write a good manuscript, but just getting in there and seeing how others write very well and how others write very poorly, I think is it can be internalized, and all it can do is good for you as far as improving your writing skills, no matter how long you've been writing. So I just wanted to just make those comments. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great observation. And I fully agree that reviewing manuscripts is a great way for solidifying your ability to write manuscripts. The only thing I would say is that, again, journals have production schedules, and they want to make sure that they have enough articles in the pipeline to publish the next issue. So if you commit to doing a review and they give you 2 or 3 weeks, please try to adhere to it, because it becomes very frustrating from the production side to have an article languishing, waiting for the 3 reviews to come back. And also it's not fair to the author, who also is expecting a certain response time from the journal. Other experiences, comments, observations?
There is a question here. I don't know, Dr. Ferrer, if you can see the chat box, but I can read it out for you if you
I
want.
don't see it on my view.
Okay, it says, does it matter the order of authorship? And if so, how do you handle potential disagreements between your colleagues without ruining relationships?
Ooh, that's a sticky one. So yes, order of authorship is important. Obviously, for individual career advancement, it makes a difference. First author versus fourth author in a list of 8. Those things again are best handled up front, to say, okay, we're going to write up this manuscript, and let's all agree that this is a fair ranked listing of the authors, who's first, who's second, who's third. Often the senior author will be placed last, but it depends on research group to research group. If there are disagreements, sometimes they need arbitration from someone else. I'm not talking about like formal legal arbitration, although sometimes it goes to that, but rarely. But within the group, to talk about, well, who did what and what's fair, and hopefully the group is coherent and group-minded enough to to have those conversations respectfully and adhere to them after the fact. But they can be high stakes.
I think that was it for the chat box. I don't know if anybody else has a comment or a question. Okay, well, with that, thank you, Dr. Ferrer, for presenting to us this afternoon, and thank you, everybody, as well. I did put the link for feedback if y'all could help us out with that, so we can give Dr. Ferrer feedback on his topic today, and thank you all very much.
And thank you. And the last thing I'll say is use us in the research section, for our Wednesday afternoon meetings to fulfill some of the things we talked about today for feedback and assistance with writing. So we're happy to do that.
Thank you, everybody.